September 1944. The fields of northeastern France stretch endlessly under a sky heavy with autumn clouds. The air smells of diesel fuel, wet earth, and the acrid smoke of distant artillery. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American tanks sit silent, their engines cold, their crews waiting, not for the enemy, for gasoline. This is the story of a decision made in seconds that changed the course of a battle. A story of one man who broke the rules to save hundreds. A story that history nearly forgot. The race across France. To understand what happened on that September afternoon, we must first understand how the Allied armies found themselves in this impossible situation. 2 months earlier, on the 6th of June 1944, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy. For weeks, they were trapped in a brutal stalemate among the hedgerows, fighting for every yard of ground against determined German defenders. Then, in late July, Operation Cobra shattered the German lines. American forces burst through the enemy's defenses like water through a broken dam. Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army raced across France at a speed that shocked even the most optimistic Allied planners. His tanks and armored divisions covered 400 miles in less than a month. They liberated villages and towns that had suffered under occupation for 4 long years. French citizens lined the roads, weeping, cheering, throwing flowers at the passing columns of American vehicles. But this lightning advance created a problem that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could solve. The Allied armies had outrun their supply lines. Every tank, every truck, every jeep needed fuel. Patton's armored divisions were like hungry beasts, consuming gasoline in enormous quantities. An armored division required more than 70,000 gallons of fuel just to move 100 miles. The Third Army was burning through 350,000 gallons every single day. The original Allied plans had assumed a slow, methodical advance across France. Supply depots would be established, rail lines would be repaired, and a conventional logistics system would support the armies as they moved forward. But Patton's rapid advance had made those plans obsolete before the ink on them was dry. The ports that were supposed to supply the advancing armies were still hundreds of miles behind the front lines. The French rail system lay in ruins, destroyed by years of Allied bombing and German sabotage. The only way to get fuel to the front was by truck. Thousands and thousands of trucks, driving day and night, racing against time itself. The Red Ball Express. On August 25, 1944, Allied commanders gathered for an emergency meeting. The solution they devised would become legendary. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from the American railroad system, where a red ball marked trains designated for express delivery, trains that would not stop, trains that had absolute right-of-way over everything else on the line. Now, that same principle would be applied to French roads. A dedicated highway loop was established. The northern route would carry loaded trucks toward the front. The southern route would bring empty trucks back to the supply depots near the Normandy beaches. Military police guarded every intersection. Civilian traffic was banned entirely from these roads. Any truck marked with a red ball had absolute priority. The express needed drivers, thousands of them. Men were pulled from anti-aircraft units, artillery battalions, any unit that had soldiers whose immediate duties were not critical to combat operations. They were given a few hours of instruction on how to drive the GMC trucks, massive 6x6 vehicles with 10 gears and dual rear axles that required double clutching and considerable skill to operate properly. 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. In a segregated army that too often relegated black soldiers to menial duties, these men were given one of the most critical missions of the war. They accepted it without hesitation. The trucks were supposed to travel in organized convoys at 25 miles per hour, maintaining 60-yard intervals between vehicles. That was the plan on paper. In reality, drivers left supply depots the moment their trucks were loaded. They drove alone through the darkness at 60 miles per hour, or faster, often in complete blackout conditions to avoid enemy aircraft. They navigated bombed-out roads, crumbling bridges, and routes that barely deserved to be called roads at all. They drove until exhaustion blurred their vision and their hands cramped on the steering wheel. Then they drove some more. The dangers were constant and varied. Mechanical breakdowns could leave a driver stranded far from any maintenance unit. German snipers and roving patrols still operated behind the American lines. The risk of accidents was enormous. Fatigue claimed as many trucks as enemy action. But the drivers kept moving because they knew that somewhere ahead, American soldiers were counting on them. Among these thousands of drivers, mechanics, and loaders were men whose names would never appear in history books, men who worked 18-hour shifts, men who repaired broken trucks by the side of the road with improvised tools and sheer determination, men who navigated by instinct when maps failed and road signs had been destroyed. And then there were the dispatchers, the men who made the whole system work. A man named Coleman Staff Sergeant Thomas Coleman was not supposed to be a hero. He was a logistics specialist, a man who dealt in numbers and schedules, not bullets and battles. His weapon was a clipboard. His battlefield was a dispatch office in a French village, whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. Coleman was 32 years old, which made him ancient by the standards of the young men who drove the trucks. He had worked as a freight dispatcher for the Pennsylvania Railroad before the war, a job that required precision, quick thinking, and the ability to make decisions under pressure. The Army had recognized his skills and put him exactly where he could do the most good. His office was in what had once been a schoolhouse. The windows were blown out, replaced with canvas tarps that snapped and billowed in the wind. Maps covered every wall, marked with colored pins showing supply dumps, fuel depots, and the constantly shifting positions of Allied units at the front. A field telephone sat on a scarred wooden desk, its bell ringing at all hours of the day and night. Coleman's job was to coordinate the flow of trucks through his sector. He received requests from forward units, matched them with available transport, and plotted routes that would get fuel to where it was needed most urgently. He worked with fragmentary information, outdated maps, and radio reports that were often garbled or incomplete. He made dozens of decisions every hour, each one potentially critical to the success or failure of operations he would never witness. The other dispatchers respected Coleman. He never panicked. He never wasted time on questions that couldn't be answered. He looked at a problem, calculated the variables, and made his decision. Then he moved on to the next crisis, because there was always a next crisis. On the morning of September 19th, Coleman arrived at his office before dawn, as he did every morning. The temperature had dropped overnight. His breath formed clouds in the cold air. He lit the kerosene heater in the corner, more for light than warmth, and studied the map on his wall. The situation was bad and getting worse. Patton's Third Army had reached the Moselle River just outside the fortress city of Metz. They were less than 50 miles from the German border, less than 50 miles from the Third Reich itself. But they had run out of fuel, literally. Tanks sat motionless in their assembly areas. Supply trucks were cannibalized for parts. Soldiers who had been racing across France just days earlier now sat idle, watching the autumn rain and wondering when they would move again. The problem wasn't just fuel consumption, it was allocation. General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had decided to prioritize supplies for Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group, which was preparing for Operation Market Garden in Holland. Patton's Third Army would have to make do with whatever was left over. What was left over was not enough. Not nearly enough. Coleman had seen the supply reports. Patton had requested 400,000 gallons of fuel. He had received 32,000. His armored divisions were stranded. His advance had ground to a complete halt. And while the Americans sat motionless, the Germans were using every hour to strengthen their defenses, to bring up reinforcements, to prepare for the battles that would come. The field telephone rang. Coleman picked it up. "Dispatch," Coleman speaking. The voice on the other end was tense, speaking quickly. It was Captain Morrison from 20th Corps Forward Supply. Coleman had worked with Morrison before. The man was competent, professional, not given to exaggeration. Sergeant, we have a situation developing at Chateau Salin. The 35th Infantry Division is preparing for an assault on German positions south of the town. They need fuel for their supporting armor. Without it, the attack cannot proceed. Coleman pulled the map closer. Chateau Salin was about 30 miles southeast of his position. He checked his logbook. Captain, I can have a column assembled and rolling within 2 hours. 15 trucks, approximately 12,000 gallons total capacity. Will that be sufficient? There was a pause on the line. It will have to be. The attack is scheduled for 1800 hours. If the fuel doesn't arrive by 1600, we will have to postpone. Coleman did the math in his head. 2 hours to assemble and load the trucks. 3 hours of driving time, possibly more, if the roads were in poor condition. That gave them a 1-hour margin for error. It was tight but achievable. Understood, Captain? I will route the column through Morhange and south on Route Nationale 7. You should have your fuel by 1530 hours. Negative on that route, Sergeant. Morrison's voice was firm. Intelligence reports increased enemy activity around Morhange. Reconnaissance observed German patrols in that sector. Route the column west to Delmy, then south. It adds 20 minutes to the trip, but it is safer. 20 minutes. In logistics, 20 minutes could be the difference between success and failure. But Morrison was right to be cautious. A fuel column ambushed by German forces would be worse than no column at all. Acknowledged. Delma route it is. Anything else? Negative. Morrison out. Coleman hung up the telephone and immediately began issuing orders. The trucks would have to be pulled from other assignments. Drivers would have to be briefed. Military police would need to be notified to provide security at key intersections along the route. Within 90 minutes, the column was assembled. 15 GMC trucks, each loaded with 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline. The drivers gathered for their briefing in the rain, water dripping from their helmets, hands shoved in pockets for warmth. Coleman laid out the route on a map, tracing the path with his finger. Delme, then south along secondary roads to Chateau Salin. Estimated time of arrival, 1530 hours. The drivers nodded. They had done this 100 times before. Maintain your intervals, Coleman reminded them. If you break down, get off the road if you can. If you cannot, mark your position and the next truck will report it. No heroics. Deliver the fuel and get back here in one piece. The lead driver was a corporal named Jenkins, a farmer from Iowa who drove his truck the way he had driven tractors on his family's land, with patient competence and absolute reliability. Coleman trusted him. Any questions? There were none. The drivers climbed into their trucks. Engines roared to life, filling the morning air with diesel smoke. Coleman watched them roll out. 15 trucks marked with red balls, carrying enough fuel to keep an attack moving forward, carrying the hopes of soldiers who waited at the front. Then he went back to his office to deal with the next crisis. The call 3 hours later, the field telephone rang again. Coleman picked it up. Dispatch, Coleman speaking. Sergeant Coleman, this is Lieutenant Hargrove, Laupioth Corps Intelligence. The voice was young, urgent. We have updated intelligence on enemy movements in your sector. German mechanized units have been observed moving west from Falcomont. They appear to be establishing blocking positions on the main road south of Delme. Coleman's blood went cold. The fuel column, the route he had sent them on. When did this intelligence come in, Lieutenant? 15 minutes ago. Aerial reconnaissance spotted the movement at 1300 hours, but it took time to get the information through channels. Coleman looked at the clock on his wall. It was 1420 hours. The fuel column had left at 1100. They would be approaching Delme right now, approaching the area where German units were setting up an ambush. Do we have radio contact with the column? Negative. They're out of range for the portable sets we have available. Of course they were. The trucks were not equipped with long-range radios. They relied on pre-planned routes and timetables. If you needed to change their orders, you had to physically intercept them. Coleman's mind raced through the possibilities. If the column continued on the planned route and encountered German forces, the result would be catastrophic. Lightly armed trucks filled with volatile fuel would be easy targets. The drivers would face a terrible choice: fight an engagement they could not win, or abandon their trucks and the precious cargo they carried. But if he tried to warn them and failed, If they took a different route that proved even more dangerous, the responsibility would be his alone. He could call Morrison, report the intelligence, and let Douai-Souancourt handle it. That would be the safe choice, the choice that covered his own back. But by the time the information moved through channels, by the time a decision was made and new orders were issued, it would be too late. The column would already be committed, already be in danger. Coleman made his decision in less than 10 seconds. "Thank you for the information, Lieutenant. I will handle it from here." He hung up the telephone before Hargrove could respond. Then he grabbed his helmet and his sidearm and ran for the door. The Chase Coleman's Jeep was parked outside, a battered vehicle that had seen better days, but still ran reliably. He started the engine and threw it into gear, the tires spitting mud as he accelerated out of the village. The road north toward Delmay was barely more than a farm track, pitted with shell craters and littered with the debris of war. Coleman drove as fast as he dared, the Jeep bouncing and skidding on the uneven surface. Rain had started falling again, a cold drizzle that turned the road into a slippery mess. He checked his watch. 14:30 hours. If the column was on schedule, they would be entering the danger zone within minutes. He needed to intercept them before that happened. But there was another problem. Even if he caught up to them, what then? The planned route was compromised. But what alternative did he have? Coleman's mind worked through the geography of the region. He had studied those maps for weeks, memorized the roads and villages and terrain features. There was another route, a logging road that ran east through the forest, bypassing Delmay entirely. It would add miles to the journey, precious time that the column could not afford to lose. But it would keep them away from the German blocking position. The question was whether the road was still passable. It had not been maintained in years. It might be washed out, blocked by fallen trees, impassable for heavy trucks. If he sent the column down that road and they became stuck, he would have failed completely. The fuel would not reach Chateau Salin. The attack would be postponed or canceled. Men might perish because of his decision. But if he did nothing, if he let the column continue on the original route, they would almost certainly encounter German forces. The fuel would be lost. The drivers would be lost. And the attack would fail anyway. Coleman made his choice. The logging road. It had to be the logging road. He pressed harder on the accelerator, the Jeep's engine screaming in protest. The road curved ahead, following the edge of a forest. And then he saw them. 15 trucks, moving in a staggered column, their red ball markings clearly visible even through the rain. Coleman honked his horn and flashed his headlights, waving frantically. The lead truck, Jenkins's truck, began to slow. The column behind him followed suit, pulling to the side of the road. Coleman skidded to a stop beside Jenkins's truck and jumped out. Rain soaked through his uniform immediately. Jenkins leaned out of the cab. "Sergeant, what is going on? We are on schedule." "No problems reported," Coleman had to shout to be heard over the idling engines and the rain. "New intelligence, German unit setting up an ambush on your route. You cannot continue this way." Jenkins's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Orders?" This was the moment when Coleman would either save this column or doom it. "There is a logging road about 2 miles ahead, east side. It will take you through the forest and bring you out south of the enemy position. The route is longer. You will be late, but you will be alive. Is the road passable, Sergeant? I do not know. The truth. Simple and terrible." Coleman did not know. He was gambling with the lives of 15 drivers and the success of an entire operation on a guess, on a memory of a line on a map. Jenkins looked at him for a long moment. Rain dripped from the brim of his helmet. Then he nodded. "We trust you, Sergeant. Show us the way." Coleman climbed back into his Jeep. He pulled out in front of the column, and the trucks followed him. 15 trucks, fully loaded, trusting a dispatcher who was taking them off the planned route into unmapped territory with only his instincts to guide them. The logging road appeared exactly where Coleman remembered it. 2 ruts carved into the forest floor, overgrown with weeds, barely visible in the fading afternoon light. It looked like a path to nowhere. Coleman turned onto it without hesitation. Behind him, Jenkins followed, and behind Jenkins 14 more trucks committed themselves to the uncertain path ahead. Through the forest closed around them like the walls of a tunnel. Trees loomed on both sides, their bare branches reaching toward the gray sky. The road, if it could be called a road, was worse than Coleman had feared. Deep ruts carved by years of timber trucks had filled with water. Mud sucked at the Jeep's tires. Fallen branches littered the path. Coleman's Jeep could handle it. The Jeep was light, maneuverable. But the GMC trucks were heavy beasts, loaded with thousands of pounds of fuel. Their dual rear tires dug into the soft ground. Their engines labored in low gear. The column slowed to a crawl, 10 miles per hour, then 5. There were moments when Coleman thought they would have to stop, moments when the path ahead seemed completely impassable, but the drivers kept moving. When one truck got stuck, the one behind it would hook up a tow chain and pull it free. When a fallen tree blocked the path, drivers would dismount with axes and saws and clear the obstruction. They did not complain. They did not question. They simply did the work that needed to be done. Coleman checked his watch constantly. 1,500 hours, 15:15, 15:30. The deadline Captain Morrison had set came and passed. The fuel was late. The attack would have to be postponed, unless they could make up time somehow, unless this gamble paid off. The forest seemed endless, mile after mile of trees and mud and cold rain. Coleman's hands ached from gripping the steering wheel. His uniform was soaked through. His mind kept circling back to the same question. What if he was wrong? What if this road did not go through? What if he had led these men into a dead end? And then, through the trees ahead, he saw light. Open ground. The forest was ending. The Jeep broke free of the tree line into a field of wet grass. Behind him, one by one, the trucks emerged from the forest, all 15 of them, every single one. Coleman stopped and consulted his map. They were south of Delmay, south of the area where German forces were believed to be operating. The gamble had worked, but they were far behind schedule. It was 15:45 hours. The fuel should have been delivered 15 minutes ago. Could they still make it? Coleman waved Jenkins forward. "How much time do you need to reach Chateau Salins from here?" Jenkins looked at the sky, calculating. 30 minutes if we push hard and the roads are clear. 30 minutes would put them at 16:15 hours. Still late, but not disastrously so. The attack might still proceed, just delayed slightly. "Then push hard, Corporal. Make those trucks fly." Jenkins grinned. "Yes, Sergeant. We will see you on the other side." The column formed up again. This time, the trucks moved with urgency, no longer constrained by the narrow forest path. They rolled across the open fields toward the road that would take them to Chateau Salins, their engines roaring, their red ball markings bright against the gray afternoon. Coleman watched them go. Then he turned his Jeep around and began the long drive back to his dispatch office, to his maps and his telephone, and the next crisis that would certainly be waiting for him. The assault. At 16:20 hours, 15 trucks rolled into the forward supply area at Chateau Salins. Soldiers swarmed around them immediately, unloading the jerry cans of fuel, distributing them to the waiting tanks and trucks that would support the infantry assault. Captain Morrison was there. When he saw the trucks arrive, saw the fuel that would allow his attack to proceed, the relief on his face was visible even from a distance. The tanks were fueled. The engines were started. At 1700 hours, 1 hour later than originally planned, but still with enough daylight remaining, the 35th Infantry Division began its assault on German positions south of the town. The attack succeeded. Not easily. There was fierce resistance. German machine guns raked the advancing infantry. Anti-tank guns damaged several Sherman tanks. But the American forces kept moving forward, kept applying pressure, and by nightfall, they had achieved their objectives. How much of that success was due to 15 trucks that arrived late but arrived safely? How much was due to one dispatcher who broke the rules and took a chance? There is no way to quantify such things. War is not a mathematical equation. It is chaos and courage and 1,000 small decisions that add up to victory or defeat. But the fuel arrived. The attack proceeded. The line did not break. And in a dispatch office in a French village whose name most people cannot pronounce, Staff Sergeant Thomas Coleman filled out his logbook, recording the column's departure and arrival times. The fuel delivered, the mission accomplished. He did not mention the German ambush that never happened. He did not mention the desperate drive through the forest. He did not mention the decision he made in 10 seconds that might have saved 15 lives. That was not his job. His job was to move fuel from point A to point B, and he had done his job. The unseen war. We remember World War II through the battles, Normandy, the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Berlin. We remember the generals and the heroes, the moments when history pivoted on the courage of men facing fire and death. But for every soldier who stormed a beach or charged an enemy position, there were dozens more who never fired a shot in anger. They drove trucks. They repaired engines. They loaded supplies and plotted routes and made decisions at desks and dispatch offices. The Red Ball Express operated for 83 days. During that time, it transported over 400,000 tons of supplies to the front lines. At its peak, nearly 6,000 trucks were on the road at any given moment. The drivers worked 18-hour shifts. They drove in blackout conditions. They navigated bombed-out roads and hostile territory. They kept the Allied armies moving when conventional logistics would have ground to a halt. And when the port of Antwerp was finally opened and the supply crisis eased, when rail lines were repaired and the Red Ball Express was shut down, these men went back to their regular duties. Most of them received no special recognition, no medals, no parades. They were just soldiers doing their jobs, like Thomas Coleman, like Jenkins, like thousands of others whose names we will never know. But their contribution was essential. Without them, the advance across France would have failed. Patton's tanks would have sat motionless. The German army would have had time to regroup, to fortify, to prepare defenses that might have made the eventual invasion of Germany far more costly. War is decided as much by logistics as by courage. An army needs bullets and fuel and food as much as it needs brave soldiers, and someone has to ensure those supplies reach the front lines. That was the mission of the Red Ball Express. That was the legacy of men like Coleman, who made split-second decisions in dispatch offices and trusted their instincts when the manuals had no answers. After the war, the records do not tell us what happened to Staff Sergeant Thomas Coleman after the war ended. Perhaps he went back to Pennsylvania, back to his job with the railroad, back to the familiar world of timetables and freight schedules. Perhaps he told his family about his service, about the day he chased down a fuel column and led them through a forest on a muddy logging road. Or perhaps he never spoke of it at all. Many veterans did not. They came home and put away their uniforms and tried to forget the things they had seen and done. Corporal Jenkins survived the war. We know this because his name appears in discharge records from early 1946. He went back to Iowa, back to farming, back to a life where the biggest challenge was the weather and the crop yields, not navigating through hostile territory with a truck full of explosive fuel. The other drivers from that column scattered to the winds when the war ended. Some stayed in the Army. Some went to college on the GI Bill. Some found work in the booming post-war economy. Some struggled with memories and nightmares that would not fade. The Red Ball Express itself became a footnote in history. A 1952 Hollywood film starring Sidney Poitier brought some attention to the operation, but it was fictionalized, sanitized, stripped of much of its complexity and truth. Only decades later did historians begin to fully appreciate the crucial role that African American soldiers played in the supply effort. 75% of Red Ball drivers were black men serving in a segregated army, men who faced discrimination and prejudice, even as they risked their lives to keep the war machine running. They deserved better. They deserved recognition. They deserved to be remembered not as a footnote, but as heroes, because that is what they were. Heroes, every one of them. The lessons. What can we learn from this story? What does it tell us about war, about leadership, about the decisions we make when everything hangs in the balance? First, it tells us that success in war depends on more than just combat power. An army can have the best tanks, the bravest soldiers, the most brilliant tactical plans. But if it cannot move, if it cannot sustain itself, if it runs out of fuel or ammunition or food, then all of that combat power is meaningless. Logistics wins wars. Not in dramatic fashion, not in moments that make good cinema, but in the steady, relentless work of moving supplies from rear areas to the front lines. Every bullet fired, every mile driven, every meal eaten by a soldier depends on a logistic system that functions efficiently and reliably. The Red Ball Express was improvised under desperate circumstances. It violated many principles of sound logistics. The trucks were overworked, the drivers were exhausted, the routes were dangerous. But it worked because the men who ran it were adaptable, resourceful, and absolutely committed to the mission. Second, this story tells us about the importance of individual initiative. Coleman was not a general. He did not command armies. He was a staff sergeant in a dispatch office, a man whose primary tool was a clipboard and a telephone. But when he received information about a potential ambush, he did not pass the decision up the chain of command. He did not wait for orders. He acted. He made a judgment call based on incomplete information and uncertain outcomes. He took responsibility. That kind of initiative, that willingness to make hard decisions under pressure, is what separates adequate soldiers from exceptional ones. It cannot be taught in a manual. It cannot be drilled on a parade ground. It comes from character, from confidence, from a deep understanding of what the mission requires. Coleman understood that his job was not to follow procedures. His job was to get fuel to the front lines. Everything else was secondary. So when the situation changed, when the original plan became untenable, he improvised. He found another way. Third, this story tells us about trust. Jenkins and the other drivers could have refused Coleman's orders. They could have insisted on sticking to the planned route, the route that had been approved by higher headquarters, the route that appeared on the maps. Instead, they trusted him. They followed him onto that logging road without knowing if it would lead them to safety or disaster. That kind of trust is built over time, through consistent competence and honest communication. Coleman had earned their trust, and when he needed it, they gave it without hesitation. Finally, this story reminds us that history is made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. Coleman was not supposed to be a hero. He was supposed to be a logistics specialist, a man who managed schedules and routes. Jenkins was a farmer from Iowa. The other drivers were mechanics, factory workers, college students, men pulled from 100 different backgrounds and thrust into uniforms and given a mission. They were not professional soldiers. They were citizens in uniform, doing their duty because their country called on them. And when the moment came, when they were tested, they did not fail. That is the true lesson of World War II. Not that we were perfect, not that we made no mistakes, but that when civilization itself was threatened, ordinary people rose to meet the challenge. They served, they sacrificed, they did what needed to be done, and sometimes in small ways that would never make the history books, they made decisions that changed everything. Château Salins today. If you visit Château Salins today, you will find a quiet French town in the Lorraine region. The streets are peaceful. Children play in the parks. The scars of war have faded, covered over by 70 years of rebuilding and renewal. There is a monument in the town square dedicated to the American soldiers who liberated the area in 1944. It lists names, units, dates, the bare facts of history carved in stone, but it does not mention the fuel column. It does not mention Coleman or Jenkins or the decision made in a dispatch office miles away. It does not mention the logging road through the forest, the trucks stuck in mud, the drivers who kept pushing forward because that was what the mission required. Those details are not carved in stone. They exist only in fading memories and yellow documents filed away in archives. They are part of the vast, complex story of the war, the parts that did not make the headlines, the parts that happened away from cameras and reporters. But they matter. They matter because they are true. They matter because they show us what war really is, not just battles and heroes, but decisions and logistics, and 1,000 small actions that add up to something larger than any individual contribution. They matter because they remind us that victory is never inevitable. It is earned. It is built from the efforts of people who might never be recognized, people who do their jobs even when those jobs are difficult and dangerous and thankless. And they matter because they show us what we are capable of when the stakes are high and the situation is desperate, and there is no good option, only choices that have to be made. The question that remains, did Coleman make the right decision? Would the original route have been safe? Was the intelligence about German forces accurate, or was it a false alarm? We will never know for certain. The fog of war is real. Information is always incomplete. Decisions must be made with imperfect knowledge, and we judge those decisions by their outcomes, not by whether they were objectively correct in some absolute sense. What we do know is this: Coleman made a choice. He acted on the information he had. He took responsibility, the fuel arrived, the mission succeeded, and somewhere in the chaos and confusion of that autumn campaign, his decision might have saved lives. That is enough. That has to be enough, because that is what war demands of us. Not perfect decisions, not flawless execution, just people who will stand up when the moment comes and do their best with what they have. People like Coleman, people like Jenkins, people whose names we remember or whose names we have forgotten, but whose actions echo across the decades. They were the ones who kept the line from breaking. They were the ones who made victory possible. And their story, though it may be forgotten by history, deserves to be told. Epilogue: the weight of a decision. Imagine you are Coleman. You are sitting in your office on a cold September afternoon. The telephone rings. You receive information that changes everything you planned. You have seconds to decide. Do you stick to the plan? Do you trust the system, trust that someone else will handle it, trust that you should not deviate from approved procedures, or do you act? Do you get in your Jeep and chase down that column? Do you send them down an uncertain road because your instincts tell you it is the right choice? The weight of that decision is crushing. If you are wrong, people will be harmed. The mission will fail. You will have to live with the consequences of your choice for the rest of your life. But if you are right, if you trust yourself and it works out, then you will have done something that matters. You will have made a difference. Coleman chose to act. He could not have known it would work. He simply believed it was the best chance they had. That is courage. Not the courage of a soldier charging into fire, but the courage of a man who makes a hard choice and lives with the uncertainty of not knowing if it was right until the outcome reveals itself. We need more people like Coleman, in war, in peace, in every situation where the easy choice is to do nothing and the hard choice is to act without certainty. We need people who will look at a bad situation and find a way through, people who will take responsibility, people who will trust their judgment even when they are afraid of being wrong, because the world does not reward passivity. The world rewards those who act, those who try, those who are willing to fail in the pursuit of something that matters. Coleman acted. The fuel arrived. The line held. And that is how one dispatcher's off-route orders pushed a gas column where the line was dying. That is how ordinary people do extraordinary things. That is how wars are won.